Hello, everyone. I started my education in a traditional sphere of economics. And having worked in the now infamous Lehman Brothers in London, and I've witnessed a consistent unreliability of data and political projections as well as economic models. So after the 2008 crash, I've decided to delve deeper and explore a hobby of mine, which was art at the time. So little did I know that after a certain time, my life would fundamentally change, not only outwardly in terms of my career path, but also inwardly in terms of my personal worldview. So when I started studying art history and researching artistic practices, what I've realized that I was most drawn to contemporary art, so art of today. And the reason for that was that contemporary art spoke more closely to our own time. And I don't mean in highlighting big historical or cultural events, but rather what it did is it reflected the problems, the thoughts, and emotions associated with the processes of our own time in a more nuanced and profound way. Now, as with many other arts, this mirroring effect of art has been researched quite extensively, both historically, philosophically, and even psychoanalytically. However, what I'd like to discuss today and bring to your attention is how we can switch our arrows of our thinking about art in order to widen our possibilities of looking, and through that make our lives perhaps better and more fulfilled. So, let's start with examining some historical art, because the importance of art in cross-cultural awareness is paramount, and it's widely accepted. Everybody knows this, and if we know a historical event, we will more better understand certain artistic tendencies. For example, let's start with Oriental miniature. So, Oriental miniature is a craft that was perfected through years, and each masterpiece took years and months and years, a long time to finish, allowing masters to perfect their skills. The mastery of miniature was passed down generations and traveled far and wide from across Persia, Middle East, and all the way to India. And it often caused blindness in its most devout practitioners, believe it or not. So what happens here is that we can think of Quranic iconoclasm, and what that reveals is that the faces of the characters are always very generic and not specified in detail. What we also see is that the picture develops on a flat surface. There's no perspective, which tells a story. It's a symbolic narrative told on one page. The whole story is told on one page, as if it's in a book, because it was a book art. And what we also see is that little details, such as trees and animals, they are carriers of symbolic meaning, as opposed to being truthful representations of themselves. And what this tells us is that Eastern philosophies were much more hidden than direct. And this understanding of Eastern philosophies explains the semiotics of miniature and the way other ideas were traditionally transmitted in the Orient. And of course, we see the abundance of gold leaf, which talks about the opulence of Islamic civilization, and also the riches of palaces and the prolific Silk Route trade. So we can also make some economic conclusions from this. Carrying ourselves west to European Renaissance, we see the rise of patronage, of private patronage on art through portraiture, and the increasing influence of religion as a theme in art, because the Catholic Church became even more powerful. What we also see is that this ultramarine blue pigment found in the most expensive commissions is made out of crushing lapis lazuli. It's a thing found only in one single mine in Afghanistan. So this already tells us about the beginning of a commodity trade with the East around that time. And this causality becomes even more direct when we move closer to our own time. When we speak of the beginning of last century, we see the emergence of modernism, of modernity, the industrialization of production, the big industrial, after the big industrial revolution, of course. So beginning of last century, the rise of the machine, and you know, the artists respond to this mechanization, trying to capture movement, acceleration in movement, and the fragmented vision associated with this movement. And you see here examples of Cubist and Futurist art from Europe at the time. However, their idealistic utopian worlds quickly crash, and after World War I, artists capture the damages of this mechanization through violence, images of violence and disfigured bodies that started populating the imagination of the artists as well as their everyday reality, unfortunately. So what this tells us is that art that comes closer to our own time becomes a little bit better understandable because we really understand the historical event that took place around that time, which is, you know, around both world wars. And coming even closer to our own time, we can then jump all the way west to America and to the unencumbered rule of capitalism, the commodification of production, and the democratization of an object accessible to everyone, celebrity culture, leading to pop art practices. Everybody knows Andy Warhol because it all became about celebrity and media. And but this also gave rise to critical practices and female liberation, so feminist art, an example here, and also criticism of control and discrimination more generally. So what we observe is that the closer, not only is it that the more we know a historical event, we understand the art of it, also the closer we come to our own time, the themes become also closer to what we think about and experience today. And I'd like to think about what that means. Of course, understanding historical events helps us understand art, but also understanding art helps us increase our cultural awareness and facilitate intercultural dialogue. And this reverse causality actually becomes more important. Why? If we think about that causality, you know, in the world of conflict today, most of the conflicts arise still from a surprising lack of understanding. So if art can help us understand the both individual and wider cultural struggles, how can it also help us understand and accept one another today? And what's interesting is that artists often act as, let's say, conduits of these energies associated with these processes and with emotions felt today, and are much more intuitively connected to, sensitive and connected to the events surrounding them. And I don't mean just, you know, artists that are very well known, or I'm not talking about particular skills, but or political awareness, let's say, or, you know, conceptual framework, but more artistic tendencies generally. So an interesting experiment it was made by a Colombian, well, it's more as an artwork, is a Colombian artist, Oscar Murillo, and he started this project in 2013. What he did is that he traveled across the world and he gave canvases to school children, aged 10 to 16, and invited them to draw freely on these canvases, as they would usually secretly do on their desks. So the resulting canvases and etchings and drawings became sort of portraits of children from different geographies. And they very nicely explained the adolescent sentiments of each particular region, of each particular country. So here you have one from Mumbai, India. You see the bright colors and natural scenes there. And one from Kenya with a more militant, more, let's say, nationalistic sentiment with a flag. Kids are getting excited about the prospect of expressing themselves. And here you can contrast and canvas on the top from Lebanon with the one on the bottom from New York, with a call for peace and a very structural understanding of the world. So what this tells us is not only about childhood psychology, but also it gives us very interesting insights into the wider cross-cultural, wider socio-political dispositions of a wider populace and not just children, because we see these tendencies repeat themselves. And my premise is that if we can use art as a tool in this way. By trying to understand art, we are actually trying to understand these tendencies. And the reason why it's easier for us to understand and really appreciate historical art is because we have a pre-existing knowledge that we impose on the analysis of it. However, what prevents us from readily accepting contemporary art, what makes it a little bit more complicated and complex, is our inability to objectively evaluate the human processes taking place in our own real time and developing as we speak. We lack this sort of distance to them to really analyze them, so art can become a tool in helping us understand those. I want to discuss 3 examples, and maybe you can think of them. The first one of contemporary art as a conclusion, so to expand a little bit. You know, the first one is Parker Ito. He is an artist from American, Japanese, German, and English heritage, and works mainly online, creates his works mainly online, and belongs to a generation of post-internet artists, but also does installations with painting, sculpture, and text. This is his self-portrait. The next one, Wu Tsang, an artist also born 1982, from Asian background, lives and works between US and Asia. And her work, she's a performer and filmmaker, and her work talks about concerns of queer and trans communities. And here you have a still from her film called Mishima in Mexico. And the next one, Shirin Nishad, born 1957 in Iran. This is a filmmaker, a photographer, an artist that contrasts Islamic values with Western values, and talks about concerns of women in Islamic society quite often. And she was actually, for her controversial views, banned by the Iranian government from going back to her country. And these 2 works are from a series, The Home of My Eyes, commissioned by YARAT Contemporary Art Space. And they express a longing for home, in a way. So, what do we see here? These artists seem to come from worlds apart. They have different backgrounds, different practices, different axes of development. However, what we see in them is that we can ask ourselves this question. What do we see? Do we see, perhaps we see both mental and physical displacement? Do we see fatigue and confusion? Do we also see fluidity of information, borders, and even bodies? So what art does, it helps us bridge the gap between different visions and thoughts, different perspectives and attitudes, and brings us closer to the other. And it is not only through understanding historical narratives that we're able to explain art, but actually by experiencing, by exploring contemporary art, that we're able to fully grasp the exigencies of our own time and understand and accept the humanity of our own humanity in our own real time today. So an attempt to understanding art becomes an attempt to understand the world we live in and to accept those who share it with us. Thank you very much.